Born August 7, 1925, Anthony Frank Nino Gadget grew up in the East Village of Manhattan. He was the youngest of three children, and by the age of 10, he began working with his father, Angelo. His father owned a barber shop, and young Nino's job was sweeping up hair and polishing shoes. As a way of self preservation, he joined a street gang which dominated his neighborhood, known as the 10th Street Mob. It is fair to say that Nino was exposed to organized crime at an early age. His cousin on his father's side was Frank Scalisi, a very respected mafioso who would later become underboss in what would become the Gambino crime family. Nino reportedly idolized Scalisi, often boasting in his family's connections. He once commented to a friend that he only wanted two things in life: to be like his cousin and to die in the street with a gun in his hand. At the age of 14, his eyes became sensitive to light, which caused him to purchase dark-tinted sunglasses to help him see. The sunglasses became sort of a trademark for his appearance throughout the remainder of his life. Cousin Frank eventually took the young Nino under his wing, giving him various jobs and teaching him the ways of Cosa Nostra. Scalisi was proud of his young cousin and secured for him a no-show job, which allowed Nino to focus more of his attention on the juice rackets. At the age of 25, Gadget came up with a scam to defraud insurance companies. He wanted his sister's husband, Dominic, to help him stage an accident, but his brother-in-law refused. Nino, to say the least, was put out, especially since he was helping his sister and brother-in-law raise their son, Dominic Santamaria Montiglio. As a result of the refusal, Nino decided never to have interaction with his brother-in-law again. By 1954, Gadget had moved heavily into stolen cars. Nino and two other associates would fabricate vehicle registrations for non-existent Cadillacs. The crew would then hire car thieves to steal Cadillacs that matched the made-up descriptions. They would then replace the stolen vehicles with new VIN numbers. The vehicles would also get new license plates, which were obtained using the falsified registrations the crew came up with. The stolen vehicles were then sold off to customers in Florida, Georgia, Texas, as well as across the border in Mexico. As a result, the money began to flow in. 1957 was a tough year for the young mobster. The family which had welcomed him in appeared to be coming apart at the seams. Turmoil and treachery were around every corner. The boss, Albert Anastasia, was shot to death while sitting in a barbershop in Manhattan, and cousin Frank was gunned down in the Bronx outside a fruit stand. Even though Gadget was tight with the new boss, Carlo Gambino, he feared that his admiration and close association with Anastasia might put his immediate family or himself in harm's way. He ordered his family, including his wife Rose, not to venture outside a few days after the death of Anastasia. When he heard that Gambino harbored no ill will towards anyone, Nino breathed a sigh of relief. In October 1960, Gadget's loyalty was to be tested when he was asked to take out Vincent Squillante. According to Dominic Montiglio, his nephew and protege, who would later turn government informant, Gadget's account of the murder was as follows. We surprised Squillante in the Bronx. We shot him in the head, stuffed him in the trunk, and then dumped him for good. Gadget's participation in this murder resulted in him being officially inducted into the Gambino family. Now that he was a made man, his responsibilities to earn for the boss took center stage. Always on the lookout for new scams, Nino came across a smart and industrious young man by the name of Roy DeMeo. DeMeo was loosely connected with members of the Lucchese family, but no one had really claimed him. The two men met and hit it off. They began doing business together, and DeMeo eventually became Gadget's guy. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, their business ventures together increased and became extremely profitable. In 1972, they forced Paul Rothenberg, who was violating state obscenity laws, by processing X-rated films into a partnership. Rothenberg's place of business was raided the following year, and so he began cooperating with authorities. Gadji ordered DeMeo to whack Rothenberg, who was found shot to death shortly thereafter. Rothenberg's killing was the first in a long line of murders committed by Roy DeMeo, who headed a crew that would eventually be suspected by law enforcement of committing between 75 to 200 murders. While Nino Gadji did not involve himself in the vast majority of these killings, there were a few in which he was directly involved with. In 1975, Gadji and DeMeo shot to death Vincent Governera, a young man with no ties to organized crime. Governera was killed as revenge by Gadji for an event years earlier when the two had become involved in a physical altercation. In 1976, Gadji and DeMeo ventured down to the Sunshine State for another revenge killing. George Byram, an electrical contractor who had assisted in the construction of Gadji's vacation home, had tipped thieves to the fact that the house was often unoccupied while Gadji and his family were in New York. Byram was shot to death and left halfway decapitated in a Miami hotel bathroom. Later that same year, Carlo Gambino, the boss of the family, died of natural causes. Paul Castellano was promoted to boss, and Della Croce stayed on as underboss. This arrangement was agreed to during a meeting which took place in Gadji's home. Gadji was close to Castellano, and he expected to be promoted to underboss when the ailing Della Croce finally passed. The books on the family had been closed for many years by order of Carlo Gambino, but Castellano opened the books, allowing for new members to be made into the family. Gadji proposed his protege, DeMeo, on numerous occasions, but the requests were denied. Castellano believed DeMeo killed too freely and that Nino would be unable to control his underling. In 1977, Gadji finally convinced Big Paul it was the right move, and DeMeo became a made man. As proof that this was the right move, Gadji reported to Castellano that it was DeMeo who had successfully formed the alliance between the Gambino family and a young group of Irish sluggers who operated out of Hell's Kitchen, known as the Westies. By this time, Gadji's nephew, Dominic Montiglio, officially became a Gambino associate and was in charge of collecting the loans from Gadji's customers. Montiglio was also put in charge of collecting the majority of the weekly payments due from DeMeo for his uncle. Montiglio's close involvement in nearly all facets of Gadji's criminal activities, particularly with the DeMeo crew, would have heavy repercussions for Gadji in the mid-1980s. On June 7, 1978, Gadji and 9 others were charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud. Even though the FBI had recordings from wiretaps, Gadji, who was extremely careful when talking on the phone, never said anything incriminating. As a result, the judge dismissed the case against Gadji. In 1979, Gadji and DeMeo were accused by another capo, James Eppolito, for drug dealing in a case involving Eppolito's son. Eppolito took his case to Big Paul, who had a policy against drug dealing within the family. Surprisingly, Castellano sided with Gadji and DeMeo and gave permission for them to whack Eppolito and his son. On October 1, 1979, Nino Gadji and Roy DeMeo shot James Eppolito and his son to death. A young man who happened to be driving by at the time saw the shooting and alerted an off-duty policeman. The officer located Gadji, who was walking away from the crime scene after he and DeMeo split up. Gadji engaged the officer in a gun battle and was wounded in the neck and arrested, being charged with murder and the attempted murder of a police officer. Through intimidation and jury tampering, however, Gadji was convicted only of assault and given a 5 to 15-year sentence. However, the conviction was overturned when a bought-off juror then accused the prosecutors of misconduct. During the time that Gadji was in prison, his nephew and protege, Dominic Montiglio, found a new best friend: drugs, and he became convinced he would be murdered by the family. As a result, he would later turn informant. Due to the fact he was close to his uncle and DeMeo, he was able to provide a joint federal-state task force with detailed accounts of their criminal activities. As the task force investigation intensified, Paul Castellano apparently felt that Roy DeMeo might cooperate with authorities. DeMeo was shot to death on January 10, 1983. His corpse found nearly frozen in the trunk of his car 10 days later. Reports stated that it may have been Gadji who pulled the trigger. As a result of the investigation and the informants who gave revelations of crimes committed, especially Montiglio, Gadji was arrested on February 28, 1984. The first trial dealt with the stolen car ring, and Gadji was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He was now, according to one prosecutor, off the street. 2 years into this sentence, Gadji was hit with more charges relating to racketeering and murder, many of which were connected to the DeMeo crew. On April 17, 1988, while being held at New York's Metropolitan Correctional Center, Anthony Nino Gadji died of natural causes at the age of 62. The subsequent trial continued for a year in Gadji's absence and ended in guilty verdicts on all counts for each of the remaining defendants, and life sentences were handed down for the remainder of Roy DeMeo's crew.
Help me! Help me, Rod. Help me!